this is what he's going to do, and ended up.
For years, the rumors surrounding the legacy of the iconic band Journey have left fans very confused. Gregg Rolie helped start the band, but then, just as they were becoming a global success, he suddenly walked away from it all. Things began to shift the very moment Steve Perry joined the band. And to date, some sources claim that Gregg Rolie left the band due to tensions and even jealousy. But the truth is far more complicated than you'd ever realize. Why did Gregg Rolie step back at the peak of the band's rise? And how did he truly feel about Perry's arrival? The truth will change how you view the band forever. The rise of Journey. In 1973, the seeds of what would become one of America's most iconic rock bands were planted in San Francisco. The band that would eventually be known as Journey began not as a mainstream rock group, but as an experimental fusion project formed by two musicians fresh off their stint with the legendary Latin rock outfit Santana. Gregg Rolie, Santana's original lead vocalist and keyboardist, and Neil Schon, the band's young guitar prodigy, were both looking for something new after growing weary of Santana's increasingly spiritual and improvisational musical direction. They had both experienced massive success during their time with Santana. Rolie had sung lead on hits like Black Magic Woman, while Schon's guitar skills had caught national attention despite him being really young when he joined Santana. But as time passed, both musicians found themselves craving a different kind of musical journey that allowed for more structure, more rock influence, and more control over the creative process. That craving eventually led them to form a new band initially known as the Golden Gate Rhythm Section. Initially, they decided to be a group of skilled session musicians who would back up other Bay Area acts. But as rehearsals continued, it became clear that they had the chemistry and talent to be much more than just a support act. By the end of the year, they renamed themselves Journey, and they released their self-titled debut album in 1975. The band's early music leaned heavily into jazz fusion, progressive rock, and instrumental experimentation, far from the arena rock sound that would later define them. Unfortunately, while those first albums showcased strong musicianship, they failed to connect with a broad audience. Despite Rolie's soulful vocals and the band's technical skill, the lack of a consistent pop structure or memorable hooks meant limited radio play and moderate commercial success. By mid-1977, Columbia Records was growing impatient. The label wanted hits, they wanted radio-friendly songs, and they believed Journey needed a stronger lead singer to break into the mainstream. Steve Perry was introduced to the band, and his arrival marked a pivotal moment in the band's history and the beginning of a new chapter that would ultimately skyrocket them to international fame. Steve Perry was a young vocalist from California with a distinctive soaring tenor voice and an uncanny ability to blend emotion with technical power. His first appearance with the band came on their fourth album, Infinity, released in 1978, and it was this album that changed everything for the band. Perry's voice brought a completely different energy to Journey's sound. Gone were the sprawling instrumental jams and fusion-heavy arrangements. In their place were tightly written, emotionally driven songs anchored by soaring vocal melodies, hook-filled choruses, and classic rock guitar lines. Perry didn't just sing, he delivered hits. His vocals had the kind of clarity and range that immediately stood out on the radio and resonated with a broader, more mainstream audience. Infinity marked a commercial breakthrough for Journey. The album gained heavy rotation on the radio and introduced the band to a whole new generation of listeners. The album went platinum and gave the band its first taste of the mass appeal it had long been chasing. More importantly, it established a creative formula that would define Journey for years to come. In the years that followed, Journey's success only grew. Their songs became radio staples, and the band's fan base exploded. Journey also became known for their high-energy live shows, with Perry as the charismatic frontman and Schon delivering solos. The band's concerts sold out arenas across the country, making them a cultural force in American rock. At the height of their fame, Journey had achieved what most bands only dream of. They had radio dominance, massive record sales, sold-out world tours, and a sound that was instantly recognizable. And yet, behind the scenes, subtle shifts were beginning to take place. As the spotlight increasingly focused on Perry, the original chemistry that had once united the band was slowly beginning to change. The changing dynamic. As Journey's commercial success exploded with Steve Perry at the helm, so too did the internal pressures that often come with fame. And for Gregg Rolie, one of the band's original architects, the transition was more complicated than fans ever realized. At first, the chemistry seemed promising. Steve Perry's arrival in 1977 was undeniably a turning point. His vocal abilities elevated Journey to a new commercial level, and the band began hitting milestones they had only dreamed of during their early years. Internally, Perry also brought a new energy, a different kind of focus, and a sharp sense of melody that helped reshape the band's sound. And initially, Rolie, who had handled both keyboard duties and lead vocals since the beginning, welcomed this shift, at least publicly. Rolie once said in an interview that Steve Perry could sing like a bird. It was a phrase he used often when describing Perry's vocal talent, and it always seemed to come from a place of genuine admiration. Over the years, Rolie consistently dismissed rumors that he was jealous of the younger singer's growing prominence. According to him, Perry's arrival made sense if Journey wanted to break through to the next level, and he respected the voice that helped make it possible. But admiration and comfort aren't always the same thing, because behind closed doors, the band was slowly changing, and not everyone was adjusting easily. Perry's growing influence in the group meant that decisions began to shift in his favor. His instincts for hit-making, his vocal-centric approach to songwriting, and his increasingly close relationship with Columbia Records all gave him an outsized presence in a band that had once been more democratic in nature. Rolie, who had shared creative control with Shun in the early days, now found himself stepping back more and more, not just from lead vocals, but from the center of the band's identity. As time went on, the band became majorly known for Perry's voice, his image, and his emotional ballads. And while Rolie was never pushed out in a dramatic way, the subtle erosion of his role was enough to create tension. On stage, Rolie still played his organ and contributed harmonies, but off stage, he began to question his place in the band. Journey was no longer the band he had helped form in 1973, and what had started as a musician's band, built on instrumental complexity and group chemistry, was now focused on mainstream appeal, arena rock anthems, and power ballads. And as the spotlight on Perry grew brighter, Rolie found himself increasingly in the shadows. It wasn't just a matter of ego. Rolie had always been a grounded, no-nonsense musician, more interested in the art than the fame. But the scale of Journey's success brought with it a kind of attention that Rolie didn't enjoy. The constant pressure to top the last album, the grueling tour schedules, and the non-stop demands from management and the label all began to wear him down. He had already lived through the intensity of worldwide fame during his years with Santana, and the prospect of going through that again, at an even greater level, was not something he looked forward to. Adding to that pressure was a growing creative discomfort. While he never denied Perry's talent, Rolie sometimes felt that the band's newer material strayed too far from its original identity. The focus was now on big vocals, glossy production, and carefully packaged songs that could climb the charts. It was effective, and it made Journey one of the most successful bands in the world. But it wasn't the kind of music Rolie had set out to make. As Perry took over more of the lead vocals and songwriting, Rolie began to question whether he still had a meaningful role in the band. And as the band reached new heights with albums like Departure and Escape, Rolie began quietly contemplating his future. He had grown tired of the fame and tired of feeling like a guest in a band he had co-founded. And so, as Journey stood at the very peak of its success, one of its founding members began preparing to walk away. But what would cause a founding member to walk away just as the band was reaching its peak? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of years, choices, and a changing vision for what Journey had become. The real reason Rolie left. In 1980, at a moment when Journey was rising to a level of fame that few rock bands ever achieve, Gregg Rolie made a shocking decision to walk away from the band, leaving the entire rock industry stunned. For fans watching from the outside, the timing was baffling. The band had just released another platinum-selling album filled with radio hits. Their fan base was growing, Their tour schedule was packed, and their momentum seemed unstoppable. So why would one of Journey's founding members leave just as the band was reaching its peak? The truth is, Rolie's decision wasn't even about Steve Perry. Despite the speculation over the years and the whispers of clashing egos, creative differences, or being pushed aside, Rolie himself has consistently rejected those narratives, saying that he didn't leave out of bitterness or frustration with Perry. In fact, he spoke positively of their working relationship, calling Perry one of the greatest voices he ever heard and crediting him for taking the band to another level. And so the real reason behind his departure was something simpler and more human. Gregg Rolie was burned out. That's right. Years of non-stop recording, relentless touring, and the growing machine of fame had taken a toll. He had already lived through that life once with Santana, touring the world and navigating the highs and lows of fame. Journey had brought him right back into the same whirlwind. And while the success was gratifying, it also came with a cost. Rolie wanted to slow down. He wanted a life outside of music, one where he could start a family, enjoy a sense of normalcy, and step away from the endless cycle of tour buses, hotel rooms, and stage lights. In interviews years later, he admitted that the pace was unsustainable for him. The music business demanded everything, and he was ready to reclaim a piece of his life before it passed him by. His departure was handled with quiet dignity and without any drama or controversy. He simply made the decision, talked it through with his bandmates, and left. It was a graceful exit, one rooted in maturity and clarity rather than conflict. Ironically, Rolie's calm and thoughtful departure would stand in stark contrast to the chaos and turbulence the band would experience in the years that followed. Because after he left, Journey continued its meteoric rise, but behind the scenes, the tension only intensified. Success brought higher pressure, tighter control, and more personal conflicts, especially as Perry's role continued to expand. But Rolie had left on his own terms. And when Journey was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2017, Rolie returned not as a guest, but as a respected founding member. His presence on stage that night, performing alongside Perry, Shun, and others, served as a full-circle moment and a quiet affirmation that even though he had stepped away, his legacy had never been forgotten. But while Rolie found peace outside the spotlight, Steve Perry, on the other hand, began heading in the opposite direction. He found himself right at the center of global fame. However, suddenly, he disappeared. What happened to the golden voice that had carried Journey to the top? And why did Steve Perry walk away at the very height of his career? Steve Perry's disappearance. By the late 90s, Steve Perry had become more than just the lead singer of Journey. He was the voice that defined an era. His unmistakable tenor had powered some of the most enduring songs in rock history. And for many fans, he was the backbone of Journey. So when he quietly disappeared from the spotlight with no official farewell and no clear explanation, it left the music world stunned and filled with questions that would linger for decades. The turning point came in 1997, just as Journey was preparing for a full reunion. The band had recently reconnected for the Trial by Fire album, a project that, on the surface, looked like the beginning of a second golden era. The album was a success, debuting in the top 5 on the Billboard charts and proving that the magic between Perry, Neil Schon, and Jonathan Cain still existed. Plans were already in motion for a tour to capitalize on the momentum. But just as rehearsals were about to begin, Perry suffered a hip injury while hiking in Hawaii, and that injury would mark the beginning of a long silence. At first, Perry hoped the pain would subside, but as doctors later diagnosed him with a degenerative bone condition, they made it clear that he would need surgery to repair the damage. However, Perry hesitated and informed his band members that he wasn't ready to get surgery done. On the other hand, the rest of the band were eager to tour and keep the momentum going. And after waiting for over 17 months for Perry's decision, they began putting pressure on him. The band members gave Perry an ultimatum to either get surgery or risk being replaced by another singer. This deadline upset Perry and spiked the tensions in the band. Perry didn't want to be forced into surgery before he was ready. The band, on the other hand, couldn't wait indefinitely. And so Perry informed his band members that he would be leaving Journey permanently. To fans, it seemed like a sudden and confusing exit. There was no public statement, no farewell tour, or formal goodbye. Perry simply faded from view. Over time, rumors filled the silence. Some sources claimed that he had quit over creative differences, that he had been pushed out by management, and that his injury had left him unable or unwilling to continue. But the truth was far more complex and rooted in personal struggles that went far beyond music. In the years that followed, Perry would later open up about what had really been going on behind the scenes. He had suffered the emotional blow of losing Kelly Nash, a woman he had fallen deeply in love with after years of staying out of the public eye. Nash was a psychologist and cancer survivor, and the two had connected through a mutual friend. But shortly after their relationship began, her cancer returned. Perry was by her side throughout her final months, and her death left a lasting impact that would shape his outlook for years to come. Perry later revealed in an interview that it was her death that led him back to his love for music. He revealed that shortly before her death, Nash made him promise never to isolate himself or stop making music if anything were to happen to her, and so after her death, he got back into making music. He once said, "Look, I'm not doing this for money. I don't need any money. I eat too much already. I can only drive one car at a time. This is about passion, but maybe it took a broken heart to get there." That loss was followed by another personal battle that Perry kept hidden from the public until much later. In the years after his departure from Journey, he was diagnosed with a rare form of skin cancer known as melanoma. Though it was caught early and treated successfully, the experience shook him, and it reminded him of how quickly life could change, and it reinforced his desire to live on his own terms, outside the pressures of fame and expectation. Alongside these physical and emotional battles was something that often goes unspoken in rock biographies: the toll on mental health. In various interviews, Perry has opened up about the isolation and anxiety that came with fame. The constant pressure to deliver, to tour, to record, and to be the voice of Journey wore him down constantly. And after years of living under that weight, he found peace in stepping away, even if it meant disappearing completely. For nearly 2 decades, Perry remained largely silent, and while Journey continued on with new vocalists and fresh albums, fans never stopped asking the same question: why did Steve Perry leave? And more importantly, would he ever come back? But then, in 2018, he surprised the world with a quiet but heartfelt return. His solo album Traces wasn't a chart-topping comeback or an attempt to reclaim his former glory. It was a personal, reflective record filled with loss, love, and vulnerability. Perry made it clear that he wasn't coming back to reclaim the spotlight, but he was simply ready to share his voice again, on his terms. But while Perry was rediscovering himself and finding peace, Journey as a band was about to face its most turbulent chapter yet. Internal lawsuits, power struggles, and accusations would soon dominate the headlines, signaling that even without Perry, the journey was far from smooth. Journey's implosion. For decades, Journey built its legacy on timeless hits, sold-out arenas, and a devoted base that never stopped believing. But behind the scenes, the story has taken a dramatic and unfortunate turn. While the band managed to push forward without Steve Perry, the years between 2021 and 2023 brought a wave of internal conflict that rocked the foundation of Journey itself. What started as creative disagreements quietly grew into public lawsuits, security standoffs, and financial fallout that few fans saw coming. But the center of the storm began with the longtime partnership between Neil Schon and Jonathan Cain. Schon and Cain had been the core songwriting duo since the early 1980s, credited with helping define Journey's golden era. Together, they helped write classics like Don't Stop Believin', Faithfully, and Who's Crying Now. But by 2021, their relationship had frayed badly. Tensions that had simmered under the surface for years finally exploded into open warfare, starting with a lawsuit over money. In November 2022, Neil Schon filed a lawsuit against Cain, accusing him of blocking access to the band's American Express account. According to court documents, Schon claimed he was being denied transparency over how Journey's shared corporate funds were being handled. As co-owners of the band's business entity, Schon argued he had every right to see the transactions. Cain, in response, filed a countersuit, and things quickly got personal. He alleged that Schon had used a huge sum of money from the band's shared account to fund personal luxury items, including expensive clothing, watches, and lavish travel for his wife. Cain painted a picture of financial irresponsibility, claiming that Shun's spending was not only excessive but also unrelated to the band's operations. He said, "Neil has always had access to the credit card statements. What he lacks, and what he is really seeking, is the ability to increase his spending limits." What might have remained a private business disagreement spilled out into the public eye, creating a spectacle that longtime fans found both confusing and disappointing. Journey, once seen as a model of classic rock endurance, was now tangled in legal filings and public accusations between its two most visible members. And the hostility didn't stop at the courtroom. During Journey's 2022 tour, the feud became so intense that both Shun and Kane reportedly hired off-duty police officers to guard their separate dressing rooms. It was an unusual and uncomfortable arrangement that reflected just how fractured the relationship had become. Even more concerning, Shun's personal assistant was allegedly caught snooping inside Kane's dressing room, raising concerns about privacy violations and further escalating mistrust between the two camps. That incident, which might have seemed like a small act of paranoia, marked just how far things had deteriorated. What was once a musical partnership rooted in shared success and mutual creativity had turned into a cold war within the band's own backstage. Adding to the tension was a moment that brought politics into the spotlight, something the band had long managed to avoid. In late 2022, Jonathan Cain performed "Don't Stop Believin'" at Mar-a-Lago, the Florida residence of United States President Donald Trump. The performance went viral, largely because Cain's wife, Paula White, had been a prominent spiritual advisor to Trump. Neil Shun responded with a cease and desist letter. He argued that Kane's decision to associate Journey's music with a political event risked damaging the band's brand. He emphasized that Journey was not a political band and that such associations could alienate fans. However, Kane, on the other hand, stood by the performance and claimed Shun was using the situation to attack him publicly. The dispute highlighted how even the band's legacy songs, which were once symbols of unity and inspiration, had become battlegrounds in their feud. As if that wasn't enough, another major player, Steve Perry, entered the legal fray in 2022. After years of silence, Perry filed a lawsuit against both Shun and Kane in an attempt to block them from trademarking the names of several Journey hits, including "Any Way You Want It," "Open Arms," and "Separate Ways," without his consent. According to Perry, his original co-writing credit gave him legal standing, and he feared that trademarking the song titles for merchandise or commercial use could diminish their artistic integrity. While the case didn't result in a major courtroom showdown, because Perry eventually dropped the suit, the move made headlines and reminded fans that unresolved tension still lingered between Perry and his former bandmates. For a moment, it seemed that Journey's most famous voice was stepping back into the fight, not to sing, but to protect his contributions. The internal strife didn't just damage relationships, it began to affect the band's business itself. In early 2023, Journey's longtime bank, reportedly alarmed by the band's legal and financial instability, cut ties with the group. The decision was seen as symbolic of just how far things had unraveled. A band that had once been a tightly run touring powerhouse was now viewed, at least in financial circles, as a liability. And sadly, the trust that had powered Journey through decades of touring and merchandising was now being questioned by partners outside the music world. But through all of this, the band kept touring. Fans still filled arenas and the music continued to ring out night after night. But behind the scenes, the story had shifted. Journey was no longer just a band with internal creative tensions. It was an organization at odds with itself, battling over identity, control, and legacy. It's a painful image for fans who grew up with Journey's music. The song spoke of hope, perseverance, and love. But the people behind them were now locked in conflict, navigating a world where success had brought as much division as it once brought unity. So where does Journey stand now? After all the breakups, lawsuits, and silence, is there still a path forward? Or has the band's legacy become too fractured to heal? But most importantly, what do the men who helped build Journey really think about each other? Rolie's thoughts and where Journey stands now. Gregg Rolie has always been the quieter force behind Journey. He was the co-founder, original lead vocalist, and keyboardist before even Steve Perry joined. Rolie shaped the band's earliest sound, singing led on tracks that changed the entire rock industry. But once Perry entered the picture, everything changed. The band's sound soared, the crowds grew larger, and so did the pressure. Although Rolie didn't resist the change Perry brought, he felt it, and eventually he stepped away. But Rolie has never publicly lashed out at Perry. In fact, in interviews over the years, he's consistently expressed respect and admiration for Perry's voice and presence. He once said Perry brought something special to the band. And while some saw his exit as a quiet protest, Rolie himself has said it was more about peace than politics because the intensity, expectations, and the touring schedule didn't align with who he wanted to be anymore. And when Perry left the band years later in the late 90s, Rolie didn't criticize him either. Instead, there was silence and perhaps understanding because Rolie had done the same thing years earlier. Still, Perry's departure left a void that no voice could ever fully fill. And Rolie, like so many original members, knew that Perry had left a permanent imprint. Even as the band marched on with new singers and ever-changing lineups, the memory of what once was never faded. Despite the chaos, lawsuits, feuds, and exits, Journey's music hasn't faded. The band may have fractured in every way possible, but their music and legacy refused to break. Steve Perry has chosen silence and healing. Gregg Rolie chose peace and family. Neil Schon and others chose the road and the responsibility of keeping the name alive. And while Journey today is more divided than ever, its legacy is stronger than it's ever been. Would you love to see Gregg Rolie and Steve Perry make a return to the band? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update.